So imagine, right, just for a moment, that you are handed this completely blank slate.
Like a total reset.
Exactly. You are tasked with designing a human civilization entirely from scratch. You have all the resources in the world. What is your very first policy decision?
I mean, it's the ultimate thought experiment.
Right. And do you start by, I don't know, drafting an economic constitution? Or do you figure out agricultural zoning for food security?
Or maybe you establish a military defense grid to secure the borders.
Exactly. Those are the go-to answers.
Because it reveals our modern biases, you know? We instinctively assume that the foundational blocks of any society are purely physical or legal.
Yeah, we think of infrastructure as concrete and steel, supply chains, codified laws.
We assume that if we just get those material conditions right, the civilization will automatically thrive.
Right, the tangible stuff, like if the plumbing works and the laws are written down, we're good.
But there's a 1,400-year-old sociological blueprint that argues none of that matters. None of it.
Yeah, that you can have all of that and still fail if you make one fatal cognitive error at the very beginning.
Right.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into an ancient text, specifically the first 11 verses of Surah Luqman from the Quran.
And before anyone rolls their eyes or tunes out thinking we're about to do some pious recitation or a theological sermon.
Yeah, let me stop you right there. We are doing nothing of the sort.
Far from it. We're stepping into this deep dive as master sociologists, as systems engineers.
Because we are relying heavily on this incredibly razor-sharp, highly unconventional analysis, it was delivered in a 1979 lecture by the scholar Ghulam Ahmad Parvez.
What Parvez did, which is so fascinating, is he just stripped away centuries of sentimental ritualistic baggage.
He looked at these texts not as, mystical incantations to be chanted for blessing.
Exactly. He looked at them as raw, socio-economic manuals for civilizational design.
And what we found in this manual is just a staggering premise. It predicts societal collapse, but not from foreign invasion.
No, and not from a lack of resources either.
Right, it predicts collapse from the mass misallocation of human attention.
Which is so relevant today. The text opens by drawing this really stark contrast between two kinds of information environments.
On one side, you have a civilization built on a highly aligned operating system, what it calls guidance and mercy.
Right. On the other, you have a society that gets completely destroyed by an information diet called Lahwal-Hadeeth.
So to understand the gravity of that, we have to look at the sequence of civilizational development, right?
Yeah, because before a society can build a single functional bridge, before it can lay down a reliable electrical grid, it has to establish its cognitive infrastructure.
The human mind is the foundational engine.
Exactly. If the informational fuel you put into that collective engine is corrupted, it literally doesn't matter how robust your physical infrastructure appears on paper.
Because the decision-making apparatus is compromised, the society will inevitably collapse.
Right. So let's look at that corrupt fuel.
Yeah, the text warns us right in verse 6 against buying into Lahwal-Hadeeth.
Which is a very specific term.
And usually ancient texts warn against things like stealing or murder or blasphemy, right?
Standard moral codes.
Yeah, but here the primary civilizational threat is, well, I've seen it translated as idle talk, which sounds like a warning against gossiping at the water cooler.
It sounds so petty when you translate it that way.
It really does. But given the systems engineering framework we're using, it has to be much heavier than just gossiping.
Oh, it is significantly heavier. In Arabic, Lahwal-Hadeeth literally translates to distracting discourse.
Distracting discourse, okay.
But Parvez reframes this away from those traditional puritanical interpretations.
Yeah.
Because for centuries, religious orthodoxy has interpreted Lahwal-Hadeeth as a strict ban on music or singing or, telling fictional campfire stories.
They reduced a massive macro-sociological diagnosis into just a petty behavioral rule to control people's leisure time.
Exactly. They completely missed the systems level warning.
So it's not about banning a guitar.
Not at all. Parvez argues this is a profound warning about systemic cognitive degradation.
Okay, break that down for me.
So Lahwal-Hadeeth is any content, whether that is cheap entertainment, political tribalism, religious dogma, endless ideological outrage that consumes immense amounts of human energy and attention without producing any deep understanding or correct productive action.
Oh, wow. Okay, let me try to ground this with an analogy.
Go for it.
So if you're managing a city and you have a limited municipal budget, you need to allocate funds to maintain the water treatment plants, fix the bridges, upgrade the power grid.
Right, the critical infrastructure.
But instead, the city council decides to spend 90% of the budget on daily fireworks displays, massive parades, hiring clowns for every street corner.
I mean, the citizens are highly entertained.
Yeah, they are glued to the spectacle. But meanwhile, the iron pipes underground are actively rusting into the groundwater.
The bridges are corroding.
Exactly. The distraction isn't just bad because it's frivolous. It's fatal because it actively stingers the critical infrastructure of the resources it needs to survive.
That captures the mechanics perfectly. Because in this framework, human attention is the municipal budget. Right.
It is a finite, highly valuable resource. When a society optimizes its entire information environment for distraction and noise, it is systematically starving its cognitive infrastructure.
Because the capacity for long-term planning, for deep structural analysis, for empathy and cooperative labor, all of that requires focused bandwidth.
Exactly. And Lahwal-Hadeeth just burns that bandwidth on friction and spectacle.
Which brings us to a really fascinating and honestly kind of chilling line in that same verse. It notes that the people who consume and spread this distraction, quote, take the path of God in mockery.
This is a crucial redefinition.
Yeah, because my immediate Western 21st century assumption when I hear mocking God is, an atheist comedian making jokes about religion or someone burning a holy book.
Or a literal insult to a deity.
Exactly. But if we are maintaining our systems engineering perspective here, the path of God can't just mean a religious identity.
Yeah.
It absolutely doesn't. In Parwez's analytical framework, the path of God, what the text calls sabila, represents the ironclad, immutable laws of cause and effect that govern the universe.
The actual physics of reality.
Yes, both natural and social physics. It's the law that says if you plant a seed and water it, it grows. If you hoard wealth and exploit laborers, the society destabilizes.
So to mock that, they aren't making fun of the deity. They are gamifying reality.
They treat the fundamental laws of consequence as a joke.
Wow.
When the text says they take it in mockery, or huzu, it means they treat real systemic issues like poverty, structural inequality, ecological collapse as mere fodder for entertainment.
Or worse, political theater.
Exactly. They don't take the cause and effect relationship of their actions seriously. They genuinely believe they can feed their minds algorithmic garbage, make massive policy decisions based on tribal outrage, and somehow magically avoid the structural collapse that mathematically must follow.
They are literally mocking the laws of sociology.
Precisely. They think they're immune to consequence.
If you're listening to this on your commute right now or while you're at work, just think about the modern political landscape. We see this constantly.
It's everywhere.
We see debates about existential, structural crises turned into viral sound bites, memes, late-night television punchlines.
We're living in an era where the primary metric for information isn't asking, is this structurally true and productive? The metric is, does this drive engagement?
We are literally the society of Lahwal-Hadeeth.
And the text outlines a very specific consequence for that societal behavior. It introduces the term azabi muhin.
Azabi muhin.
Yeah. A society that prioritizes algorithmic noise over deep understanding suffers a, quote, humiliating destruction. Notice the adjective there.
Humiliating, not just destroyed.
Right.
Why that specific word? Because usually societal collapse is framed as a tragedy, like an empire falls to a barbarian horde, and we view it as this tragic historical event.
The humiliation stems from the self-inflicted nature of the collapse.
Oh, I see.
When a society converts its guidance system, its institutions of journalism, its universities, its scientific bodies, its philosophical discourse, into a hollow spectacle, it willfully blinds itself.
It becomes a ship without a rudder.
Exactly. Just entertaining itself to death on the deck while the hull is actively taking on water.
So the destruction is humiliating because they possess all the potential. They had all the cognitive capacity, all the physical resources required to build a flourishing civilization.
And they squandered it on empty discourse.
They didn't lack the means. They actively chose the noise.
It's an unforced error on a civilizational scale.
So if Lahwal-Hadeeth is the toxic sludge that rots a civilization's operating system from the inside out, what is the antidote? What is the high-quality input that actually builds the structural integrity of a society?
This is where we get into the concept of hikmat.
Which is universally translated as wisdom, right? The text literally calls itself the Book of Wisdom.
It does.
Mm.
But honestly, wisdom is such a diluted word in English.
Yeah, I hear wisdom and I think of an old man with a long white beard sitting on a mountain speaking in confusing riddles. It sounds incredibly passive.
The Western conception of wisdom has indeed become highly abstract, very philosophical. But the linguistic root of hikmat in Arabic is intensely physical. It is grounded in survival and engineering.
How so?
Historically, ancient Arab shepherds used a derivative of this exact term to describe the physical act of gathering their scattered sheep.
Okay.
If the flock was wandering off toward a cliff edge or a pack of wolves, the shepherd's intervention to pull them back into a cohesive, safe unit was a manifestation of this root word.
It is the active prevention of fatal dispersion.
Exactly. And Parwaz takes that even further with an incredible analogy about water. He describes hikmat as the act of establishing banks for a river.
That is such a powerful image.
It is perhaps the most crucial metaphor for understanding the systemic function of wisdom in a society.
Because think about the physics of a river. If you have a massive, roaring volume of water and there are no banks, what do you actually have?
You have a catastrophic flood.
Right. The water spreads out uncontrollably, it destroys homes, drowns crops, and leaves utter devastation in its wake.
Total chaos.
But if you take that exact same volume of water, with that exact same kinetic energy, and you build sturdy, carefully engineered banks on either side, the destructive flood vanishes.
Suddenly you have a directed irrigation system.
You have a force that can power hydroelectric turbines. You have a system that sustains an entire region.
And the raw energy hasn't changed by a single drop.
The structure around the energy has.
That is the mechanical definition of hikmat. Human energy, our passions, our intellect, our daily labor, our ambitions, that's the water.
And without structural logic, without a systemic framework guiding it, human energy dissipates into chaos, or it turns actively destructive.
Wisdom is not sitting on a mountain pondering the infinite. Wisdom is the hard mathematical engineering of those riverbanks.
It is the structural logic that channels raw human potential into productive civilizational outcomes.
Precisely. So wisdom is an active structural pursuit.
Which leads to a really fascinating linguistic disruption Parwaz makes regarding who this text is actually for.
Yes, the target audience.
Right. Because if you open almost any standard English translation of these opening verses, it will say that this book of wisdom is a guide for the pious, or the righteous, or those who fear God.
It frames the audience as people seeking personal, spiritual purity.
But Parwaz completely shatters that translation. He draws a hard line between two distinct behavioral categories, the mutaki and the muzinin.
And this distinction is vital for understanding why so many socioeconomic systems fail.
Let's unpack that.
The traditional translations usually conflate these terms, treating them both as generic markers of just a good religious person. But let's look at the mechanical reality of a mutaki.
The root word is often associated with piety or fear. Right?
Usually, yes. But if you asked a 7th century Bedouin Arab what a mutaki was, they wouldn't describe a person praying in a mosque. They would give you a physical, environmental description.
Right. The anecdote from the source material is incredibly visceral. The Bedouin described a man walking down a narrow path in the desert, but the path is lined on both sides with thick, thorny bushes.
A very common hazard.
And to get through this path, the man has to gather his flowing garments tightly around his body. He steps very carefully, dodging to the left, dodging to the right, hyper-focused on ensuring that the thorns don't snag his clothes or scratch his skin.
The defining characteristic of that man is that he is playing defense.
Playing defense.
Yes. A mutaki is someone who is fundamentally risk-averse. In the journey of life, their primary operating mode is self-preservation.
They want to avoid making mistakes, avoid getting entangled in societal corruption.
Exactly. Avoid the thorns of life and arrive at the end of their journey safely with their clothes untorn and their personal moral ledger clean.
They just want to survive the system without getting infected by it. And look, playing defense is necessary. You don't want to walk blindly into a bush of thorns. But if you spend your entire life just dodging thorns and keeping your own clothes clean, you haven't actually built anything.
You survived, but you didn't create a single thing of value for anyone coming behind you.
The path is still covered in thorns.
Which is why Surah Luqman, in its opening verses, explicitly states that this systemic guidance is a mercy specifically for the musin, not the mutaki.
It deliberately elevates the target audience from those who passively avoid harm to those who actively engineer reality.
Yes.
So, mechanically, what is a musin?
The word comes from the root husan, which means to beautify, to elevate, to improve, to restore balance, and to add tangible value.
Okay.
If the mutaki is playing defense, the musin is playing offense. A musin isn't satisfied with just walking down the thorny path without getting scratched.
A musin looks at the path and decides to pave it.
Exactly. They actively clear the thorns. They lay down stone, they plant fruit-bearing trees along the side. They leave the universe fundamentally better, structurally and aesthetically, than they found it.
They are the builders. They're the architects, the scientists, the civil engineers, the artists, the policymakers who are actively upgrading the human condition.
There's an illustration from the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal that Parwez references here, and it completely shifts how we view the human role in the universe.
Share that one. It's brilliant.
Iqbal imagines a dialogue between the creator and humanity. God says, "I created the raw clay, the mud." And the human responds, "Yes, and I took that raw clay and I spun it into a beautiful, functional goblet."
Wow.
God says, "I created the dark, terrifying night." And the human says, "And I invented the electric lamp to light it up."
It is the ultimate rejection of fatalism.
Entirely. This text is not speaking to passive participants who just want to endure a miserable life and wait for a mystical reward at the end. It's speaking exclusively to the co-creators.
To be a musin is to recognize that the universe, by design, is unfinished.
Right. The raw materials are provided, the clay, the iron, the physical laws of thermodynamics, the water cycle. But the act of beautification, the structural optimization of society, is left entirely to human agency.
You are the active agent tasked with upgrading the universe's design.
That is the core mission.
Okay, so we've established the players. We have the builders, the musin, whose goal is to channel human energy into upgrading society by building the riverbanks of Hikmat.
Right.
But here is where we hit a massive structural roadblock. Building riverbanks is exhausting. Clearing thorns is brutal, backbreaking labor.
It's immense work.
So if I am a builder and I have the skills to manipulate the raw clay of the universe, why wouldn't I just build a beautiful, sturdy riverbank exclusively for my own private farm and let everyone else downstream get flooded?
Classic selfish incentive.
Yeah. What is the actual mechanical incentive here to build for the collective?
You've just identified the central dilemma of every socio-economic theory in human history. To understand how this blueprint solves it, we have to examine the two core operational pillars mentioned in the text, Salat and Zakat.
Okay. And just as we did with the previous terms, we must ruthlessly strip away the ritualistic baggage here.
We have to.
Please do, because when you say Salat, 99% of people immediately think of the physical ritual of daily prayers.
Of course they do.
And while that ritual holds deep meaning for individuals, telling me that a society is going to achieve utopian infrastructure just because everyone prays 5 times a day, that completely fails as a socioeconomic blueprint.
From a systems engineering perspective, Parwez defines Salat as strict, flawless, and unwavering adherence to systemic laws. It is operational discipline.
Okay, operational discipline.
He points to the natural world to illustrate this. Consider a migratory bird. It flies thousands of miles across oceans, navigating treacherous storms and invisible wind currents.
Without a map.
Without a GPS.
Right.
And it lands precisely in the correct nesting ground. It is perfectly unyieldingly aligned with the biological and magnetic laws guiding it. It does not deviate from the system.
The analogy of the Arab racehorse from the source text makes this even clearer.
I love this analogy.
Right, because in traditional Arab horse racing, the horse that comes in second place isn't just called the runner-up. It has a specific, highly respected title, the Musali.
Which shares the exact same root as Salat.
Exactly. And the defining characteristic of the Musali isn't just that it's fast, it's that it tracks the #1 horse so perfectly, its head is right at the flank of the leader.
It never falls behind out of laziness.
But it also never breaks rank to overtake chaotically. It maintains absolute perfect operational distance and speed.
In a civilizational context, establishing Salat means creating a society where the institutions, the legal frameworks, and the individuals are perfectly synchronized with the universal principles of justice and productivity.
It's a society running like a finely tuned engine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where everyone understands their role and executes it in perfect alignment with the greater good without chaotic deviation.
So Salat is the discipline, it's the alignment. But discipline alone doesn't feed people.
No, it doesn't.
Which brings us to Zakat. Now, usually, zakat is translated as charity. It's a 2.5% tax on your surplus wealth. You toss a few bucks in the donation bin, you give some spare change to the needy, and you've fulfilled your duty.
That is the common understanding, yes.
But that completely fails as a civilizational blueprint. Charity relies entirely on the wealthy having a surplus and, more importantly, feeling generous enough to part with it. It's a band-aid on a broken system, not a foundational economy.
Treating zakat as a mere charity tax fundamentally misrepresents the sheer scale of the concept. The Arabic root of zakat means nourishment, continuous growth, and the systemic removal of impurities that hinder development.
So it's much bigger than a donation box.
Parwez defines it as the ultimate macroeconomic engine of the state. It is not an individual act of pity. It is the systemic provision of the means of development to every single member of humanity, completely free of charge.
Wait, free of charge? If everything is provided free of charge, who is funding this? Who is paying the staff? Who is sourcing the materials? It sounds like an impossible utopian fantasy.
Let me use the analogy of a Midway hotel from Parwez's work to explain the mechanics.
Okay, Midway Hotel.
Imagine humanity is traveling across a vast, arduous highway in the desert. The society establishes this midway station. When a traveler pulls in, they're provided with food, shelter, medical care, mechanical repairs for their vehicle.
Right.
But there is no cash register. They are provided these things not because they have capital to exchange, but simply because they are a human being on the road of life. The system is structurally designed to ensure every human reaches their maximum potential.
Okay, but again, the math has to work. If the traveler isn't paying, the resources have to come from somewhere. The food doesn't magically appear in the hotel kitchen.
The resources come from the collective surplus of the muzin, the builders. The individuals in this society work to their absolute maximum capacity, driven by the operational discipline of Salat. They take only what they strictly need to maintain their own health and efficiency. And they willingly, voluntarily surrender the entirety of their surplus labor and wealth into the systemic pool of zakat.
And right there is where the entire thing sounds like it hits a brick wall.
I know, it sounds unrealistic.
Because Parwez isn't the first person to propose this. You brought up Karl Marx in the source material, and the parallels are glaring.
They really.
Marx looked at the brutal inequities of unchecked capitalism,
Right.
where the workers generate all the surplus value and the owners hoard it, and he proposed essentially the exact same socioeconomic end goal.
Right. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Exactly. Marx correctly identified the disease. He saw the structural violence of capital accumulation, and his vision for the cure, a society where labor is harmonized and resources flow to where they are needed rather than where capital dictates, is structurally identical to the output of zakat.
It is, but Parwez highlights the fatal mechanical flaw in Marx's philosophy, a flaw that Marx himself, if you read deeply into his struggles, could never resolve.
The mechanism of human motivation.
Precisely. The Marxist dilemma is a psychological one. How do you convince a human being to wake up every single day, go to the factory or the field, work relentlessly to the absolute maximum of their physical and intellectual ability, take only the bare minimum required for their own survival, and gladly give the entire surplus of their hard labor away to a collective pool for strangers?
You can't. If we are purely biological creatures living in a purely material universe, that behavior is entirely irrational. The biological drive is self-preservation and resource hoarding. If I work 80 hours a week and generate a massive surplus of grain, and my neighbor works 20 hours a week, why would I give him my grain?
You wouldn't.
If my life ends when my heart stops beating and this material world is the only reality that exists, I am going to enjoy the fruits of my own labor. I'm going to buy a bigger house, secure my own comfort, and completely ignore the Midway Hotel.
And because that biological drive for self-interest is so strong, how did the 20th century implementations of Marxism try to enforce this sharing?
They had to use violence. Because they couldn't incentivize the behavior internally, they had to enforce it externally. Russian communism, Chinese communism, they had to build massive totalitarian state apparatuses.
They used the secret police, the gulags, forced collectivization.
Exactly. Terror to pry the surplus out of the hands of the workers. They tried to build the Midway Hotel at gunpoint.
And it collapsed. Because you cannot police human motivation forever. External coercion eventually breeds resentment, corruption, and systemic rot.
Unchecked capitalism fails because it optimizes for greed, creating massive inequality. State communism fails because it requires totalitarian violence to enforce unnatural altruism.
So the ultimate question for our socioeconomic blueprint is this. How does Surah Luqman solve the Marxist dilemma? What is the internal engine that makes a human being willingly surrender their surplus without a gun to their head?
Right.
It introduces the final critical protocol, Akhirah.
Hold on, you're bringing in the afterlife. You promised me at the very beginning of this deep dive that we are doing systems engineering today, not a Sunday school sermon.
I did.
If you tell me that the entire economic engine of this civilization relies on the fear of hellfire, or the desire to get a harp on a cloud, this entire blueprint falls apart as a rational socio-economic model. It's just a religious threat.
That is a completely fair pushback. And if Akhirah meant what traditional theology says it means, you would be right.
Okay.
But in part was a systemic framework. Akhirah does not mean a mystical realm detached from reality. The literal root of the word simply means the future, or the continuum.
So it's not about a different dimension, it's about time.
It is the ultimate long-termism. It is the profound structural realization that life is not a finite closed loop that terminates at the individual's physical death.
It's an expanded time horizon.
Yes. It is the understanding the human consciousness and the consequences of human actions flow forward through future generations, through the ongoing evolution of humanity, and through stages of existence we are currently building toward.
Okay, to make this concrete, let's look at the farmer analogy from the text, because this completely rewrites the concept of sacrifice.
Go ahead.
Imagine a farmer standing in a field under the blazing sun. He is breaking his back, sweating, exhausting himself to till the hard soil. He holds in his hands his most precious resource, a sack of grain.
Right.
Now, he could easily take that grain, go back to his house, bake bread, and enjoy a feast today. He could consume his surplus, but instead, he takes that precious resource and he throws it into the dirt. He buries it.
To someone who only understands the immediate material present, to a creature operating purely on short-term biological drives, the farmer's behavior looks like absolute madness.
Completely irrational. Why are you throwing away your food and exhausting yourself for nothing in return today?
But the farmer isn't insane. He operates with absolute certainty, what the text calls yakin in the future harvest.
He knows, mathematically and scientifically, that the seed planted today, while seemingly lost in the dirt, will yield 100-fold in the future.
Yes. He is willing to sacrifice his immediate consumption because his time horizon extends beyond today.
That is the missing incentive. That is how the blueprint solves the Marxist dilemma.
Exactly. Akhirah provides the rational psychological justification for systemic altruism.
So you, as a Muslim, are willing to work to your maximum capacity and distribute your surplus through the Zakat system because, with absolute certainty that your investment in the human continuum will yield a massive evolutionary return.
You aren't losing your surplus to strangers. You are investing it into the future of this system, a system which you are eternally a part of.
So the Marxist worker feels robbed because his time horizon ends at death. The Muslim feels empowered because their time horizon is infinite.
Without this long-term horizon, without the protocol of Akhirah, any economic system will inevitably collapse inward into short-term hoarding and tribal self-interest.
You can't build a permanent civilization with people who only care about the next fiscal quarter or their own retirement fund.
It is the only way a society can sustain the intense effort required to build the riverbanks. You are building the electric lamp not just so you can read tonight, but so that the light will continue to shine and be upgraded long after you have physically departed the room.
This is a massive paradigm shift. It connects psychology, economics, and time into one seamless mechanism.
It's brilliant engineering.
So, if a society actually pulls this off, if they reject the algorithmic rot of Lahwal-Hadeeth, if they adopt the structural wisdom of Hikmat, if they align their actions flawlessly through Salat, distribute their resources freely through Zakat, and power the entire psychological engine with the long-term certainty of Akhirah, what is the actual tangible output of that system?
The text, in verses 8 and 9, promises gardens of bliss.
And once again, I feel like we need to heavily deprogram our modern understanding of these words.
We really do. When people hear Jannat or Gardens of Bliss, they immediately picture a pastoral painting of heaven, an otherworldly paradise handed out as a magical reward after you die for being a well-behaved person.
Right.
But in this socio-economic analysis, we have to look at how these terms functioned as systemic outputs for the people who first heard them.
And to do that, we have to tackle the concept of haq, which is translated as truth. This part of the reading completely broke my brain because the Western English-speaking world has a fundamentally different definition of truth than the ancient Arabic world did.
How so?
In modern English, when we say something is a truth, we almost always mean it's an abstract philosophical concept or a correct factual statement. If I say, it is true that all humans deserve equal rights, that is a truth. But it's an ideal. It lives in the realm of ideas.
Exactly. Western philosophy, heavily influenced by the Greeks, often separates the ideal from the material. But to the ancient Arabs, the concept of haq was not an abstract theory.
Right.
A theory, no matter how beautiful, logical, or morally sound, was not considered haq until it was established as a tangible, physical, undeniable reality on the ground. To realize an idea in the truest etymological sense is to make it real.
I want to make sure you, the listener, really grasp this because it's so counterintuitive to how we speak today. Think about a modern politician. A politician stands at a podium and says, "It is my truth that we need better roads."
We might applaud them for having a good policy idea.
Yeah, but under the framework of haq, that politician hasn't spoken truth. They've just made a noise. The truth of their statement doesn't exist until the asphalt is actually poured, the road is paved, and cars are driving on it. The physical road is the truth.
It is a profoundly pragmatic worldview. There is a historical anecdote Parwaz shares that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, the 40,000 cities one. Yes, share that.
Right. So during the early, rapid expansion of the civilization inspired by this exact text, an outsider, a learned man from a neighboring established empire, approached one of the early Muslims.
Okay.
He asked, "What is the truth of your ideology? Prove the truth of this book to me." Now, if you asked a modern religious person that question, they would likely sit down and recite scripture or argue philosophical theology.
Or try to prove the existence of a deity through a logical syllogism.
Exactly. But the Muslim in the anecdote didn't do any of that.
He didn't say a word about theology.
He pointed to the horizon. He essentially said to the outsider, "Look around you. Do you see the 40,000 cities and fortresses we have reorganized? Do you see the trade routes we have secured from bandits? Do you see the systemic poverty we have eradicated, the irrigation systems we have built, and the unprecedented stability we have established across multiple continents in just a few decades? That is the truth of our word."
We made it real. The socio-economic reality on the ground was the proof of the ideology. It wasn't a debate. It was a physical demonstration of cause and effect.
Precisely.
So when Surah Luqman promises gardens of bliss as the consequence of running this operating system, it's not saying, do these rituals and magically you'll wake up in a garden in another dimension. It's saying, if you run this socio-economic blueprint, the mathematical structural output will be a literal earthly paradise.
And consider the specific imagery used to describe this output. The text consistently describes Jannat with imagery of dense, impenetrable shade, perpetually flowing rivers, a limitless abundance of fruit.
To us, living in modern air-conditioned cities with massive supermarkets and indoor plumbing, that description might just sound like a pleasant afternoon at a well-maintained public park. It doesn't sound like a civilizational triumph.
But put yourself in the shoes of a Bedouin living in the scorching, unforgiving Arabian desert in the 7th century.
Yeah, the sun is a lethal threat.
Water is incredibly scarce and requires massive labor to extract from deep wells. Food insecurity is a constant daily reality.
So in that environment, what does it mean to create a society with dense shade, permanent flowing water, and guaranteed food security?
It represents the absolute pinnacle of advanced infrastructure. It means you have mastered hydrology, you have mastered complex agriculture and botany, you have engineered the physical environment to completely conquer the brutal heat and scarcity of nature.
Wow.
It is the ultimate metric of a flourishing, technologically and sociologically advanced society.
The Gardens of Bliss is advanced infrastructure. It is not a magical reward pulled out of thin air by a deity. It is the natural, structural, cause and effect consequence of a self-reinforcing, highly productive society.
A society where the Musin use hikmat to build the riverbanks, where resources are shared through Zakat and human potential is maximized.
And the most important part of Parwaz's analysis here is that this bliss starts here, in this world. You don't have to die to experience the structural benefits of a just society. It manifests here and then continues forward into the future continuum.
But naturally, a skeptic might raise an objection here.
Oh, absolutely.
A listener might say, this is all a very cohesive, elegant theory. But how do we know this specific socio-economic system of shared resources and structural alignment is actually the right way to live? Why is this better than hyper-individualistic capitalism or tribalism?
Isn't this just one sociological theory among many?
Exactly. And the text anticipates that exact skepticism. To prove that this systemic approach is objectively valid, The text does something mind-blowing in verses 10 and 11.
It pivots completely away from human sociology, economics, and behavior. And it points directly upward at the physical universe itself.
It essentially says, if you want to know how to build a human civilization, look at how the cosmos is engineered.
This is where the text brilliantly bridges sociology and astrophysics. It challenges the listener to observe the macrostructure of reality. Verse 10 explicitly states that the Creator built the heavens without pillars that you can see.
The Arabic phrasing is very precise. Bigeri amadin turanaha.
Without pillars that you can see. I love that phrasing because it doesn't say without pillars at all. It implies that the structural pillars absolutely exist, but they are invisible to the naked human eye.
It is a flawless description of gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces that hold the cosmos together. The text is pointing out that the universe is not a chaotic void. It is held in perfect, immense balance by massive structural scaffolding. The planets don't crash into each other. The stars maintain their precise orbits within galaxies. Just because you can't physically see the gravitational tether between the Earth and the Sun doesn't mean the infrastructure is magic. It is hard, calculated, immutable physics.
And the lesson for human civilization is profound. Parwez's point here is that every working system runs on principles that most people never inspect.
The pillarless sky is a prompt to stop assuming that stability is an accident.
Just because the laws of human sociology, the devastating consequences of hoarding wealth, the slow, long-term cognitive rot of Lahwal-Hadeeth aren't immediately visible to the naked eye like a brick wall falling over, doesn't mean they aren't as real and absolute as gravity.
You can't see the societal decay happening in real time, but the invisible pillars of cause and effect are always operating. If you violate them, the structure falls.
And the text zooms in from the cosmic scale to the planetary scale to really drive this home. It describes the Earth itself. It says the Earth is moving rapidly, carrying us along. The Arabic word implies a smooth, continuous sweeping motion, but that it is equipped with mountains acting as stabilizers, or wawasya, so that the surface doesn't convulse and throw us off into space.
The bullet train analogy is the best way to visualize this.
Oh, yeah. Explain the bullet train.
If you are sitting in a massive high-speed bullet train going 200 miles an hour, you can set a full cup of coffee on the tray table in front of you, and the surface of the coffee doesn't even ripple.
It's perfectly still.
You don't feel the terrifying velocity of the train because the engineering, the stabilizers, the suspension system, the aerodynamics is so masterfully designed.
The text is telling the listener you are currently standing on a giant rock hurtling through the vacuum of space at tens of thousands of miles an hour, and you don't even feel a tremor because the systemic stabilization of the planet is perfect.
It demands an intellectual respect for the engineering of reality. But it doesn't stop at physics. It moves into biology.
This part is wild.
And here, the text throws in a detail that is truly astonishing, especially considering it was articulated over 14 centuries ago. In describing the vastness of this created order, it casually mentions the existence of biological life forms, or daba, scattered not just on the Earth, but throughout the heavens.
Wait, let's just pause on that. It explicitly mentions biological life outside of Earth in a 7th century text.
Yes. Parwez references a connecting verse, Surah 42, verse 29, which uses the exact same linguistic framework. It states that the creation of the heavens and the earth includes the dispersion of living creatures within them both. It doesn't specify what kind of creatures. Daba is a broad term for moving, biological life that requires sustenance.
That perfectly mirrors the cutting edge of modern astrobiology. Right now, humanity is spending billions of dollars sending rovers to Mars, drilling into the ice of Europa, and peering into the atmospheres of distant exoplanets with the James Webb Space Telescope.
And what are we searching for? We're searching for water.
Because the fundamental operating principle, which this text established centuries ago, is that the universe operates on uniform laws. Where there is water, there is the potential for biological life.
The universe is teeming with the potential for life, governed by the exact same physical and biological laws everywhere.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. The final crucial point of this cosmic comparison. If you look at the universe, it runs on a massive, perfectly balanced, shared infrastructure.
Right. The gravity, the water cycle, the atmosphere, the electromagnetic field. These are universal resources that sustain all life. No single planet, no single species owns the laws of physics.
The sun doesn't shine only on the wealthy. The rain doesn't fall only on the powerful. It is a shared, open-source operating system.
So what happens when humans on this tiny little rock try to hoard the physical resources of the Earth for their own individual or tribal gain?
They glitch the system. They cause a critical, catastrophic error in the software. And the text has a specific, highly charged word for this systemic glitch: zulm.
Zulm is a word that appears constantly in these texts, and it is almost always translated simply as oppression, tyranny, or wrongdoing. It's treated as a generic moral failing.
But systemically, Parwez defines zulm with mathematical precision. Zulm means placing something where it fundamentally does not belong. It is displacement.
When a human being or a corporation or a nation-state claims absolute exclusive ownership over the universal resources, the land, the water, the natural wealth, the means of production that were structurally designed to nourish all of humanity, they are committing zulm.
They are displacing the creator's design. They are taking something that belongs to the collective universal system and locking it in a private vault.
Let's bring this right down to the listener's daily reality. If you are working at a massive corporation and your labor is generating millions of dollars in profit, but the company's leadership hoards all of the surplus wealth into executive bonuses while you and your coworkers can barely afford to pay rent, that isn't just unfair in a moral sense.
According to this socio-economic blueprint, that is zulm. The executives are actively glitching the operational system of the company and, by extension, the society.
It is the socioeconomic equivalent of trying to hoard gravity. It is absurd, and it is violently destructive to the operating system.
Zulm is the arrogance of looking at the perfectly engineered bullet train, which was designed to carry everyone safely to the destination, and deciding to rip up the seats, dismantle the life support systems, and hoard the engine fuel in your private cabin.
You aren't just being selfish. You are mathematically guaranteeing that the train is going to derail and crash.
And that is the true definition of a wrongdoer in this context. They aren't just people who skipped a prayer or broke a minor rule. They are the people glitching the societal operating system.
They are ignoring the invisible pillars of justice and equity that hold human civilization together, just as surely as gravity holds the solar system together.
If you break the law of gravity, you fall. If you break the law of Zakat and commit zulm, your society falls. The laws of recoil don't care about your excuses.
So if we pull all of these threads together, we can see the grand architecture of Parwez's analysis. We started with the ultimate thought experiment, designing a civilization from scratch.
What we found in these first 11 verses of Surah Luqman is a media literacy and socio-economic manifesto written 14 centuries ahead of its time.
The profound takeaway here is the synthesis of permanence and change. The technology we use to communicate changes, but the immutable laws of human systems do not.
In the 7th century, the Lahwal-Hadeeth, the distracting discourse that destroyed cognitive infrastructure, was tribal superstitions, shallow campfire tales, and petty blood feuds.
Today, the Lahwal-Hadeeth is algorithmic social media feeds, 24-hour polarized political outrage cycles, and infinite frictionless entertainment. The medium has evolved, but the sociological law remains exactly the same.
Societies that invest their attention and resources into deep understanding, systemic alignment, and the universal nourishment of their people will mathematically outlast societies that invest in compelling noise and selfish hoarding.
What you feed your mind isn't just a personal lifestyle choice to help you relax after a hard day. It is the foundational policy decision of your entire reality.
If you consume junk, your cognitive infrastructure rots, your decision-making degrades, and your physical infrastructure will inevitably follow.
It is a stark, almost brutal warning about the mechanics of reality. But it is also an incredible empowerment. The universe has already provided the invisible scaffolding.
The raw materials are there. The physics are stable. The bullet train is running smoothly on its tracks. The rest, the engineering of the society, the building of the riverbanks, the distribution of the surplus, is entirely up to us.
The created order is a standing proof that design without visible scaffolding is the norm, not the exception. The question is whether humanity will align its societal structures with that universal design, or continue to mock the laws of cause and effect until the inevitable collapse.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you step back into your day, your workplace, your community. Take a hard, honest look at your own daily reality. Look at your information diet.
Look at how you spend your surplus energy and resources.
Are you simply acting as a mutaki, just keeping your head down, dodging the thorns of modern outrage, trying to survive the week, protecting your own peace without contributing anything to the structure?
Or are you a musin?
Are you actively seeking out high-quality inputs, the wisdom that builds riverbanks so that you can actually build the lamp that lights up the dark for the people coming behind you? The invisible pillars are holding up the sky right now. The universe is waiting. What are you going to build underneath them?